CBS Y&R, spoilers, full. The breakdown of Jack and Diane's marriage didn't happen in a single explosive moment. Were Jack and Diane truly never happy together? I sensed this very clearly. As they stood on opposite sides of the courtroom, both knew that the life they had tried to rebuild together was finally shattered forever. Why did Jack always distrust Kyle, refusing to give his son control and inheritance of Jabot? Was there some ulterior motive? What happened didn't just damage his reputation. It destroyed the fragile trust Diane had tried to rebuild with him. When the truth was revealed, Diane didn't hesitate. She pushed him away with a cold decisiveness Jack had never seen in her before. In the past, Diane had always fought to protect their relationship, even when the whole world seemed determined to separate them. Jack collapsed into Patty's arms, bad-mouthing Diane and wanting to end the relationship. Instead of pleading, instead of begging her to stay, he accepted the punishment almost as if he believed he deserved it. The silence between them grew heavier, and the house they had once shared began to resemble a place haunted by memories rather than full of life. When Diane finally filed for divorce, Jack signed the papers without objection. To outsiders, it looked like surrender. But to Jack, it was an acknowledgement that whatever they once had was now too broken to be mended. The courtroom itself was colder than either of them imagined. The legal process stripped their marriage down to numbers, papers, and cold negotiations over property. The lawyers spoke in carefully calculated terms about finances, ownership, and agreements, as if the years Jack and Diane had spent building their life together could be broken down like accounting entries. The Abbott estate investments, houses, businesses, all suddenly became part of a calculation neither wanted to face. Diane tried to hold her breath, but the emotional weight of the moment weighed down on her with overwhelming force. As the discussion turned to dividing their shared life, tears finally welled up, shattering the calm facade she had tried to maintain. She felt betrayed in a way more painful than any financial loss. Diane had spent years fighting to maintain her place in the Abbott family, proving to everyone that she was no longer the manipulative woman they had once believed her to be. She believed Jack understood that change better than anyone else. But standing there now, she felt as though everything she had tried to rebuild had crumbled because of his choices. But Jack wasn't the only one harboring anger. While Diane sobbed, Jack's frustration smoldered inside him until it could no longer be contained. The tension between them had been building long before the divorce proceedings began. Every glance, every whispered accusation, every painful memory piled up within him. Initially, he was willing to accept Diane's verdict, to let her believe that he alone was responsible for the breakdown of their marriage. But the more he listened to the lawyers talk about betrayal and responsibility, the more something inside him twisted into rage. For years, he had lived with a truth that never truly subsided. He had tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that the past no longer mattered. But the bitterness of the moment brought that old wound back to the surface. And suddenly, Jack could no longer remain silent. His voice, sharp and piercing, shattered the solemn silence of the courtroom. The sudden outburst stunned everyone present. Diane looked up at him through her tears, bewildered by the anger in his face. Jack's words poured out like a storm, finally erupting. He declared that Kyle was not his biological son. That declaration came with devastating force. For a brief moment, the entire room seemed to freeze in disbelief. Diane's face turned pale as the accusation echoed through the courtroom walls. Jack's voice trembled with a mixture of rage and anguish as he revealed the truth he'd carried in his heart for years, that Kyle was the son of another man, that Diane had been cheating on him long before their marriage reached this final breaking point. The shadows in the Abbott mansion had never felt so suffocating. For decades, the sprawling estate had been a symbol of power, resilience, and unshakable family unity. But today, the silence within its walls was heavy, pregnant with the scent of impending ruin. In the dimly lit study, Jack Abbott sat motionless in his father's leather wingback chair. The crackling embers in the fireplace cast dancing, erratic shadows across his pale, drawn face. He was a man hollowed out. The recent kidnapping had stripped him of his legendary armor. The days spent in captivity, the psychological torture, the agonizing uncertainty of whether he would ever see his family again, it had all left him with a lingering tremor in his hands and a haunted, vacant look in his eyes. He jumped at sudden noises. He lost his train of thought mid-sentence. The titan of Genoa City, the indomitable head of Jabot Cosmetics, was bleeding out emotionally, and the sharks were beginning to circle. Foremost among them was his own wife. Standing in the doorway, partially obscured by the heavy velvet drapes, Diane Jenkins Abbott observed her husband. There was no warmth in her gaze, no well of wifely sympathy for the trauma he had endured. Instead, her dark eyes were cold, calculating, and sharp as cut glass. Where others saw a man in desperate need of healing, Diane saw a liability. More importantly, she saw an unprecedented opportunity. For months, Diane had played the role of the reformed, devoted matriarch. She had weathered the scorn of Ashley, the relentless scheming of Phyllis, and the icy judgments of Nicky Newman, all while clinging to Jack's protective arm. But now that arm was trembling. Jack's weakness was a threat to everything she had secured. Jabot Cosmetics, the crown jewel of the Abbott legacy, was vulnerable. If the board sensed Jack's mental fragility, they would move to install a temporary CEO, perhaps even reaching out to Ashley or Billy. Diane could not let that happen. She had not crawled her way back from the dead, clawed her way into the Abbott mansion, and secured a ring on her finger just to be sidelined. If Jack was too weak to hold the throne, she would simply have to take it from him. The execution of her betrayal was swift and merciless. Less than 48 hours later, Jack was sitting at the massive mahogany desk in his Jabot office, trying fruitlessly to focus on a quarterly earnings report when the heavy glass doors swung open. Diane walked in, flanked by a high-powered divorce attorney whose reputation in Genoa City was built on scorched earth litigation. Jack looked up his brow, furrowing in confusion as a thick manila envelope was slid across the polished wood of his desk. "Diane, what is this?" Jack's voice was raspy, lacking its usual commanding baritone. "It's over, Jack," Diane said, her voice a perfectly modulated mask of sorrow and resolve. "I've filed for divorce." Jack stared at the papers, the words blurring together as his exhausted mind struggled to comprehend the betrayal. "Divorce. After everything we just went through, I was taken from you, Diane. I survived for you. For our family." "You didn't survive, Jack." "Not really," Diane replied, stepping closer, her tone dripping with a venomous pity that made Jack's stomach turn. "The man who came back to me is a ghost. You're paranoid, you're weak, and your erratic behavior is a danger to this family and to Jabot. You brought this darkness to our door. You betrayed the fundamental promise you made to keep us safe." Betrayal. Jack stood up, his hands flat on the desk to steady his shaking knees. "I was the victim of a violent crime. I defended you against my own blood. I alienated my sister for you, and the moment I stumble, you hand me divorce papers." "You destroyed the foundation of our trust," Diane countered smoothly, reciting the narrative she and her lawyer had carefully crafted. "You are unfit to lead this family, and you are unfit to lead Jabot. I am doing this to protect Kyle's legacy, to protect the company. You leave me no choice." The sheer audacity of her words left Jack paralyzed. She was twisting his trauma into a weapon, painting his victimization as a moral failing. As she turned on her heel and walked out of the office, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering in the air, Jack realized with a sickening dread that the kidnapping had only been the prologue to his true nightmare. Weeks later, the tension inside the Genoa City courthouse was palpable, a thick, suffocating fog that seemed to press down on everyone in the gallery. The media had caught wind of the spectacular collapse of the Abbott marriage, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, society gossips, and corporate spies eager to see the mighty Jack Abbott brought low. At the plaintiff's table, Diane sat looking the picture of devastated elegance. She wore a muted navy blue suit, her hair styled conservatively, a delicate silver cross resting at her throat. She was playing the role of the grieving wife to absolute perfection. Across the aisle, Jack sat rigidly beside his counsel. The dark circles under his eyes were pronounced, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle ticked furiously in his cheek. When Diane was called to the stand, a hush fell over the room. The rhythmic click of her heels echoing on the hardwood floor sounded like the ticking of a time bomb. She took the oath with a trembling hand and sat down, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Her attorney approached the podium. "Mrs. Abbott, can you describe for the court the state of your marriage following your husband's return from his kidnapping?" Diane took a shuddering breath, looking directly at the judge. "It has been a living nightmare, Your Honor," she began, her voice cracking with practiced emotion. "I loved Jack with all my heart. I thought our bond was unbreakable. But the man who returned to the Abbott mansion was not my husband. He became hostile, paranoid, and completely detached from reality." Jack closed his eyes, his hands balling into fists under the heavy oak table. Asterisk, lies times, he thought. Asterisk, nothing but vicious, calculated lies. Asterisk. "He betrayed the sacred trust of our marriage," Diane continued, a single perfect tear rolling down her cheek. "He refused to seek help. He lashed out at those who loved him most. He shattered the peace of our home, turning what was once a sanctuary into a place of fear and instability. He completely destroyed our happiness." "Objection," Jack's lawyer interrupted mildly. "Relevance, Your Honor. The emotional state of the defendant does not warrant the aggressive corporate restructuring the plaintiff is demanding in the settlement." "Overruled," the judge stated flatly. "I will allow it. Proceed." Diane shifted her gaze toward the gallery, her eyes locking on to Kyle, who sat in the front row. Kyle looked pale, his expression torn between the mother he had idealized and the father who had been his entire world. "It's not just about me, Your Honor," Diane sobbed, her voice rising in theatrical anguish. It's about my son, my poor Kyle. He looks at his father and sees a stranger. Jack's erratic, destructive behavior has inflicted deep, irreversible trauma on our boy. Kyle has watched his father dismantle the legacy of John Abbott piece by piece. Jack has hurt Kyle in ways that can never be undone. I am here today fighting for control of Jabot, not for myself, but to save my son from the wreckage his father has created. At the defense table, Jack felt a physical snap within his chest. It was as if a frayed, heavy cable that had been holding his sanity together finally gave way. The walls of the courtroom seemed to warp and close in on him. He could tolerate the insults to his pride. He could even stomach her brazen attempt to steal the company his father had built. But to use Kyle to weaponize the son he had loved, protected, and nurtured to claim that times he times Jack was the source of Kyle's pain, while Diane sat there dripping with hypocrisy, it was a bridge too far. The sheer, unadulterated evil of her performance ignited a blinding, white-hot fury in his blood. All the fear, the helplessness of the kidnapping, the weeks of gaslighting and manipulation boiled over in one catastrophic eruption. Lies. Jack's voice boomed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. He stood up so violently that his heavy wooden chair tipped backward, crashing against the railing behind him. "Mr. Abbott," the judge barked, slamming his gavel. "Sit down, immediately." Jack ignored him. He bypassed his horrified attorney and stepped out from behind the table, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, unhinged intensity as he pointed a shaking finger at Diane. "You sit there and talk about betrayal," Jack roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You dare invoke my father's name. You dare talk about what I have done to Kyle." "Jack, please," Diane whimpered, shrinking back in the witness box, playing the frightened victim for the judge. But internally her heart leapt. Asterisk. Yes, times, she thought. Asterisk. Lose control. Show them exactly how unstable you are. Asterisk. "Order, bailiff. Restrain Mr. Abbott," the judge shouted, hammering the gavel repeatedly. "You want to talk about destroying this family," Diane Jack continued, his face flushed, spit flying from his lips as the bailiff approached him. The dam had broken. The darkest, most heavily guarded secret of his life, a truth he had sworn to take to his grave to protect the boy he loved, clawed its way up his throat. He couldn't stop it. He wanted to destroy her. He wanted to wipe the smug, calculating martyrdom off her face forever. "You want to talk about Kyle's legacy," Jack screamed, his voice shredding with raw, agonizing desperation. "Let's tell them the truth, Diane. Let's tell them the truth about your precious son. Kyle is not my biological son." The words hung in the air, suspended in a horrifying frozen vacuum. For a fraction of a second, the universe seemed to stop. The rhythmic scratching of the court reporter's machine ceased. The whispering in the gallery died instantly. The judge's gavel hovered in midair. Then the shockwave hit. Diane's face went completely slack. The practiced tears dried up instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. All the color drained from her perfectly manicured face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll that had just been shattered. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The secret she thought was buried, the lie that had secured her place in the Abbott dynasty, had just been detonated in open court. "No," Diane whispered, her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand so hard her knuckles turned white. "No, Jack, you're lying." "I have the DNA tests," Diane Jack bellowed, tears of rage and profound grief streaming down his face. "I've known for years I kept your filthy secret because I loved him, because he was my boy in every way that mattered, but I will not let you use him to steal my family's company." Total chaos erupted. The gallery exploded into a deafening roar of gasps, shouts, and frantic whispering. Reporters scrambled for their phones, entirely ignoring the judge's furious demands for order. The bailiff grabbed Jack by the arm, but Jack didn't fight him. He just stood there, his chest heaving, staring at the destruction he had just unleashed. Slowly, agonizingly, Jack turned his head toward the front row of the gallery. Kyle was standing. He looked as though he had been physically struck. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on Jack with a look of absolute soul-crushing devastation. The world Kyle had known, his identity, his bloodline, his inherent right to the Abbott name, his entire history had just been incinerated in a matter of seconds. "Dad." Kyle's voice was barely a whisper, but in Jack's mind it echoed louder than the chaos of the room. It was the voice of a little boy whose universe had just ceased to exist. "Kyle." Jack breathed the blinding rage, suddenly evaporating, leaving behind a cold, horrifying realization of what he had done. He reached a hand out toward the gallery. "Kyle, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But Kyle didn't wait. He stumbled backward, knocking into the wooden benches, his eyes darting frantically between the weeping, paralyzed form of his mother on the stand and the broken, desperate man he had called his father. Unable to breathe, unable to process the magnitude of the lie that was his existence, Kyle turned and bolted through the heavy double doors of the courtroom, fleeing into the corridors. Court is adjourned, the judge bellowed over the pandemonium, striking the gavel with finality. Bailiff, clear the room! Clear the room immediately! As the crowd surged toward the exits, eager to broadcast the scandal of the century, Jack sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He had stopped Diane's corporate coup, but the cost was unfathomable. The revelation sent immediate catastrophic shockwaves through the foundations of Genoa City. The implications were staggering. If Kyle was not a biological abbot, the bloodline clauses intricately woven into the Jabot Cosmetics charter were suddenly triggered. Kyle's shares, his voting rights, his position as co-CEO, everything was thrust into legal jeopardy. The board of directors would be thrown into a panic. Ashley and Tracy would be utterly blindsided, their family tree violently pruned in the public eye. Diane remained frozen in the witness box, the reality of her ruined master plan crashing down upon her. She had tried to exploit Jack's weakness to steal an empire, but in doing so, she had pushed him to unleash a nuclear truth that stripped her of her only true anchor to the Abbott family. Without Kyle as the biological heir, Diane's leverage evaporated. She was no longer the mother of the future Abbott patriarch. She was a fraud who had lied about the paternity of her child. The doors of the courtroom slowly closed, but the damage was irreversible. The Abbott family, once a beacon of loyalty and generational pride, was fractured beyond repair. Jack sat in the emptying room, the silence returning, but it was no longer the suffocating silence of the mansion. It was the deafening silence of a battlefield after the slaughter. A tense, dark new chapter had begun. The battle lines for Jabot Cosmetics would no longer be drawn between a husband and a wife, but among a family torn apart by a lie decades in the making. Power, identity, and legacy were all thrown to the wind, and as Jack looked up at the empty space where his son had just stood, he knew that the war for the Abbott soul had only just begun.